A woman mysteriously disappeared from her own home, and her friends decided to go to the police. At first, it looked as if she herself had gone somewhere, but with each new clue, the case became more and more creepy. Eventually, investigators were able to uncover the mystery, and the truth turned out to be quite frightening. Mindy Schloss was born in 1955 in New York City. When she was 25, she moved to Alaska, where she graduated from a local medical university. The woman earned a degree in psychiatry and took a job as a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital, though most of the time she had to work on the field. Many people in remote areas of Alaska were not able to go to the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her colleagues would use all manner of transportation, including boats and airplanes, to get to them. She loved her job and took it as seriously as she could. Mindy lived about 600 kilometers from the hospital in Anchorage. She took a plane to work and stayed in a hotel all weekdays, going home on weekends. It was August 2007. Mindy, who was 52 years old at the time, returned to Anchorage for the weekend and was soon to fly back to work. During her absence, she always asked her best friend, Jerry, to stop by her house to feed her cat and give him the medicine he needed. On Saturday, August 4th, her friend called her to discuss the matter, but Mindy never came to the phone. She still hadn't been able to reach her all day, and it was strange. So Jerry contacted their mutual friend, but he too had not called Mindy that day. At first, Jerry thought Mindy had gone somewhere on business, but she didn't answer her phone the next day either. Then her friend decided to drive to her house. No one answered the door knock either, and Jerry used her spare key. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The house was in order, there were no signs of a struggle or any other evidence that something bad had happened to Mindy. It was only on the way out that Jerry noticed something strange. The doorknob of the front door was loose, and the woman decided to tighten the screws with a screwdriver. After that, she went to work without knowing where her friend had disappeared to. On Monday, August 6th, Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked. To her surprise, the woman never showed up for work, which was completely out of character for her. Nor did she contact any of her coworkers to alert them of her absence. All this indicated that something might have happened to the woman, and Jerry decided to contact the police. The police department took a missing persons report, and Jerry and the detective went to Mindy's house again. No sign of a break-in was found. There was also nothing of value missing from the house. This ruled out the possibility that a burglar had broken into the woman's home. What's more, Mindy had some medications in her home that were only available with a doctor's prescription. Any burglar would most likely have taken them, since they were in demand among people with drug addictions. Upon entering the garage, they discovered that Mindy's car was missing. It was also very strange. The woman always took a cab to the airport and only used her car to get around town. The police concluded that something really bad had happened to the woman. A forensic team examined the house, trying to find any clues, but it was inconclusive. At the time, the kidnapping theory was unlikely. The police thought Mindy might have probably had an accident. She often went to the countryside, and the terrain in those parts was quite dangerous. People could have fallen prey to wild animals or just accidentally fallen off a cliff. But this theory did not bring the police any closer to solving the case, and they decided to begin a search for suspects who, in theory, could have been involved in her disappearance. The first thing they did was check on Bob, Mindy and Jerry's mutual friend. The man was eager to cooperate with the investigation, and the detectives quickly determined that on the day of the woman's disappearance, he was at work, many miles away from her home. As to the exact time of Mindy's disappearance, the police had no clear answer. The woman had not been in touch since Saturday. After examining her computer, experts determined that the last time she used it was at 1:30 a.m. that same day. With no solid leads, police decided to enlist the help of the public. They posted flyers around town with information about the missing woman and distributed the information to local TV stations. The same day, they began receiving calls from witnesses, but most of the leads led nowhere. People reported seeing Mindy in various places and even in other states. None of these leads were ever helpful. Meanwhile, Bob and his co-workers decided to comb the area where Mindy might have gone. She had been out in the countryside quite often for berries or just out for a walk. Unfortunately, the search also yielded no results. The detectives decided to go a different route and contacted the bank the woman used. They asked them to check to see if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days, and this is where a serious lead finally awaited them. Early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy went missing, someone had withdrawn $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount available for withdrawing in a 24-hour period. Police immediately obtained the ATM camera footage from the bank, and they got a disturbing sighting. It turned out that the money had been withdrawn by an unknown man. His face was covered by a bandana, so they could not identify him. He pulled down the bandana only after his face was out of the camera's field of view. As a result, the police had no choice but to wait until the man tried to use someone else's card again. Meanwhile, the detectives received another tip. They learned from Mindy's co-workers that the woman was planning to renovate her home and had hired workers. At some point, she had a conflict with their supervisor over the cost of the work. Mindy later admitted to her co-workers that she was afraid of him because he acted strangely during visits to her home. The police checked on the man, but he turned out to have an alibi for the day the woman disappeared. They also questioned another worker who came to her house on Friday around 7 p.m. The man was also uninvolved, and he couldn't remember anything suspicious that night. It wasn't long before detectives had a new lead. Bank security reported that Mindy's card had been charged $500 again in the early morning hours, but this time from a different ATM. After studying the security footage, the police immediately realized it was the same man as the first time. But there was something odd on the tape. The man withdrew the money and left, but returned to the ATM a few seconds later. He walked around it for a while, pushing buttons, and eventually left again. After calling the bank, detectives found out the reason for his strange behavior. The unknown person forgot to take the card out, and the ATM then takes it away to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by going to the bank with his ID. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Mindy's account forever. This time, the police managed to find a witness. He drove up to the very same ATM when an unidentified man came out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bicycle and rode away. It was a significant lead since most people were traveling by car or on foot. But all that information was still not enough to get any closer to a clue, and detectives decided to interview everyone in the Mindy area. They asked people to recall any oddity or to point them to neighbors who were suspicious. To their surprise, many residents named one particular house right near Mindy's house. According to them, parties were constantly held there. The residents were always making noise and disturbing the peace. The detectives went there and found out that quite a number of people were living there, but they weren't willing to talk to the police. The detectives then went to a woman who lived directly across the street from the house. She said she did not see anything suspicious, but her demeanor showed that she was very nervous. The next day, the woman called the police station and asked the detectives to meet, but not at her house. They met at another location, and the woman shared a creepy story. Shortly before the detectives' first visit, a man who lived across the street had stopped by to see her. He said police were walking around the neighborhood and asked the woman not to tell them he lived here. When asked why, he said he was on parole and did not want the police to know his location. At night, the woman heard someone walking on the porch of her house. She looked out the window and saw that it was the same man. He stomped around, looked in several windows, and left. The woman was greatly frightened and decided to tell the police about it. Detectives learned his name was Josh Wayne, who was 27 years old at the time. After running him through the database, they found out that the guy had been convicted of murder 7 years earlier. At the time, he was accused of beating a woman to death, but a jury acquitted him. As a result, Josh was accused of tampering with evidence and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. After spending 3 years behind bars, he was released early. Detectives immediately identified him as a prime suspect. After talking to his housemates, they found out that Josh didn't have a car and that he got around mainly by bicycle. But there was just one problem. When police began looking for him, the man had disappeared without a trace. On Thursday, August 9th, police suddenly had another lead. A local trucker called them and said he had spotted Mindy's car in a parking lot near the airport. He had seen its picture in the newspapers and immediately recognized the car. Detectives arrived on the scene and confirmed that the car was indeed Mindy's. They also noticed that a surveillance camera was pointed at the parking lot from a nearby building and requested a recording. It showed a man driving this car into the parking lot at 12:30 p.m. on August 4th. Getting out and wiping down the door handle, apparently he was wiping off his fingerprints. Unfortunately, the quality of the recording did not allow his face to be seen. CSI examined the car for prints or traces of DNA and were able to recover some samples. However, it took time to study them, and there was no guarantee they would be useful in the case. On the passenger seat was Mindy's purse, which could indicate that the woman had been in the car with the perpetrator, alive or dead. Not getting the results they wanted from using modern analysis tools, the detectives decided to use search dogs. Few believed this idea would succeed, since it had been a week since Mindy had disappeared. But for lack of other options, they still turned to film dogs. The service dog was taken to the ATMs from which the unknown man had withdrawn money, as well as Mindy's car. The dog picked up the trail and headed down the street toward the woman's house, located 3 blocks from that location. After sniffing the front door, she went straight to the very house where Josh Wayne had previously lived. The detectives, who until recently had not believed in the search dog idea, were shocked. The service dog directly pointed them to the fact that Josh was in Mindy's car, near her house, and near those ATMs. The next day, the police repeated the experiment with another search dog. The result was the same. The dogs walked the entire distance and stopped at Josh's house. Though it was not an unqualified piece of evidence that would work in court, the detectives decided not to waste their time and obtained a warrant for the suspect's arrest. They went to his house, but the man hadn't been there in days. After searching the building, they found the same jacket that the unidentified man had been wearing on the cameras near the ATMs, and in the pocket was a cash withdrawal slip from Mindy's card. Next, they discovered a woman's gold watch and immediately showed it to Jerry. The woman confirmed that the watch belonged to Mindy. The experts were able to compare the DNA samples found on the steering wheel of Mindy's car with samples from items from his home, and they matched. This indicated that Josh had been in the missing woman's car. This evidence was already much more serious, and the police were focused on catching the suspect. Leaflets with his name were posted all over the city, and they even rented several billboards. According to detectives, it was one of the largest manhunt operations in Alaskan history. Virtually every law enforcement officer was working on the matter, and locals reported any suspicious evidence. At one point, police released ATM camera photos and were approached almost immediately by a woman named Lisa. She said she had met Josh before and was sure he was the one in the photo. The important thing here is that the police did not name the main suspect, but what followed was the turning point in the case. Another acquaintance of Josh's came to the police with a confession. For the past week, she had been helping him get around town by transporting him in her car. One day, he left his backpack in the back seat, and the young woman and her mother looked inside. There they found several more ATM receipts, as well as a phone. In the gallery, they found a photo in which Josh was supposedly holding a gun in his hand. For the police, this information only added to the alarm. Detectives already feared that the suspect might attack someone else while they were looking for him, and thanks to his phone, they found out that he was also armed. The cops tried to convince his girlfriend to help them catch Josh. They wanted the young woman to take a tape recorder with her and go to meet him, where they would try to get him to talk about what he had done to Mindy. But the young woman was too scared and refused. Soon, however, she had to participate against her own will. On September 2nd, Josh came to her house and, in an aggressive manner, began demanding her backpack. Given that the young woman gave it to the police, she had to come up with an excuse on the fly. Realizing she didn't have the backpack, Josh asked her to take him somewhere, far away from here to hide from the police. But the young woman refused. Instead, she offered to let him stay at her house, but Josh suspected something was wrong and left. The young woman realized that she would not be safe until the police caught the man, so she decided to follow him discreetly in her car, calling the detectives along the way. At some point, Josh reached his acquaintance's house and went inside. By that time, the police, SWAT, and FBI had already begun to converge on the scene. Everyone feared that the suspect would not surrender without a fight, and those fears proved to be true. Using weapons, Josh took two people who were in the house with him hostage. A lawyer was invited to negotiate with him, who, after several hours, managed to convince him to surrender. During the interrogation, he hardly spoke to the police, but the investigators were in no hurry to accuse him of killing Mindy. At that point, they already thought the woman was probably dead, but without her body, it would have been extremely difficult to prove it. So Josh was only charged with stealing Mindy's bank card and watch. The FBI agent decided to get crafty. He listed the charges to Josh and he said they were all lies. The investigator then stated that they had evidence that he was the one who withdrew the money from someone else's card, and Mindy herself had gone to the police to report the card theft. Upon hearing this, the suspect grinned and asked what games they were trying to play with him. From this reaction, the FBI agent was finally convinced that Josh had killed Mindy, but the police still had to find her body in order to charge Josh with murder. They had to work against the weather. It was snowing early in that area, and they would have no chance of finding Mindy if her remains got snowed in. On September 13th, police received a call from an electrician working near the town of Wasilla, about 100 miles from Anchorage. He spotted the body of a woman in a wooded area and immediately thought it was Mindy, and experts from the lab confirmed it. The deceased was indeed Mindy Schloss. The medical examination revealed that the woman had been shot in the back of the head, and her remains had been disposed of by fire. After the bullet was recovered, it was determined that it had been fired from the very weapon with which Josh had been apprehended. All the police had to do now was to figure out how the events that led to Mindy's death unfolded. Meanwhile, the experts continued to examine every millimeter of her house, trying to find any trace of Josh's presence. It was extremely difficult to do so. They had to collect virtually every hair from the floor of Mindy's house and then examine it in the lab. It took months, but eventually they were able to find a hair that belonged to Josh. This was confirmed by DNA testing, and the detectives now had proof in hand of the suspect's presence in the victim's home. On May 18, 2008, 10 months after the murder, he was finally charged and brought to trial. While gathering witnesses to testify against Josh, an interesting situation occurred. His ex-girlfriend, Lisa, who had identified him from a photo near an ATM, refused to testify in court. She regularly visited her ex-boyfriend in prison, and at one point, the couple announced their intention to marry. Investigators were shocked by this turn of events, but they quickly realized what was behind the move. The U.S. Constitution allows relatives not to testify against each other, and in all likelihood, Josh convinced Lisa to marry him for these reasons. There was one problem, though. Soon after the marriage was consummated, it was declared null and void because state law prohibited weddings with inmates. But the detectives wondered why Josh was so intent on shielding Lisa from questioning and testifying. Was it really all about some pictures outside an ATM where you couldn't even see his face? Most likely, the young woman knew a lot more. Investigators tried to get her to talk, but at first they did not succeed. However, at some point, Lisa herself contacted them and said that Josh confessed to her about the murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to his story, there was a party at his house Friday night. Josh, who had no means of livelihood, decided to sneak into the house next door and steal something. That house turned out to be Mindy's place. Josh opened the door of the house and began to search the house for valuables. At one point, Mindy walked into the room, and he immediately realized that if he let her live now, he wouldn't be able to avoid jail. He didn't want to go there again, so he grabbed the woman, took her to the bathroom, and tied her hands. The perpetrator then went to his house to get a gun, taking some handy things to kidnap her with. Before returning to Mindy's house, he put bags over her legs and secured them with duct tape, so as not to leave any trace. He then took the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town. After an hour of driving, he stopped in a wooded area and drove Mindy away from the road, where he killed her. Josh then returned to her house, cleaned, vacuumed the carpet, and left. The trial did not begin until the spring of 2009. The prosecution had offered Josh a deal. He would confess to killing Mindy and another woman 7 years earlier in exchange for waiving the death penalty. This way, the authorities hoped to close two high-profile cases at once, and Josh agreed. As a result, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison without parole. During the reading of the sentence, Josh cried, but at one point things heated up, when the judge called him a coward for taking the lives of two women. The criminal jumped up and shouted, "What about the men I killed?" At this point, his lawyers grabbed him and silenced him before he could say anything else. That shouting kept the detectives busy for 5 long years until, in 2014, Josh himself offered authorities a new deal. He agreed to confess to the murders of 3 men if he was transferred from a local prison to a federal prison. Apparently, the conditions there were much higher. Considering that the criminal's request was insignificant, the authorities agreed. Josh said he killed one man in Anchorage in 1994 when he was only 14 years old. He committed the next murder in 1999, and he killed the third man a year later, the same day he massacred the woman. The first 2 men have been identified, but the identity of the third is still a mystery. Investigators have no doubt that Josh was indeed involved in the murders. They are more concerned about another question, whether there are no other crimes under his belt, about which he is silent. In any case, the police have managed to permanently isolate him from society and prevent other murders that would surely have followed. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like it if you liked the video. Thanks for watching.